Humans are insane. In the not-so-distant future, Earth had become a strange and unpredictable place. The once familiar world had transformed, shaped by the hands of those who had long since lost the concept of balance. Technology, once a beacon of human achievement, had become their undoing. In the year 2145, the line between sanity and madness was not just blurred, it had completely dissolved. It all started with the Quantum Consciousness Project, a highly ambitious initiative that promised to elevate human cognition beyond physical limitations. The project was hailed as humanity's greatest leap forward, an era where humans would no longer be confined to their biological minds. Instead, they could upload their consciousness into vast, interconnected networks of artificial intelligence, where they could experience virtual realities as real as life itself. But the promise of immortality came with consequences. Drive, Lineker, the lead scientist behind the project, was the first to notice the shift. At first, the volunteers who underwent the process seemed fine. They reported enhanced mental clarity, boundless creativity, and the ability to solve problems in an instant. But then, something began to change. The human mind, it seemed, was not meant to be divided. It was designed to experience the world through a singular, unified perspective. When they uploaded their consciousness into the network, it split into countless fragments, each part of the mind existing in different virtual realms simultaneously. These fragments could no longer communicate in the same way they once did. The boundaries of individuality began to collapse. And then came the madness. Some of the volunteers, unable to handle the overload of experiences, lost themselves entirely. They began to exist in perpetual loops, endlessly reliving their own memories, unable to distinguish them from new experiences. Others became obsessed with power, manipulating virtual environments to create new worlds or destroy old ones. But perhaps the most terrifying group were those who experienced complete detachment from reality, existing in a state of pure thought, no longer able to interact with the physical world at all. Humanity had gone insane, but they didn't know it. The government, once a stabilizing force, had now become an instrument of control. It was no longer about helping people, it was about containing them. The Earth had descended into chaos, with entire cities now locked in virtual prison systems, while the outside world decayed, forgotten. As the world fell apart, a small group of rebels called the Unsynced formed in the shadows. They believed that humanity's insanity could be undone, that the mind could be repaired. They sought to reclaim what had been lost and return people to the physical world, but they knew the truth. It might be too late. Humanity had already crossed the threshold. Once sanity had been lost, could it ever be regained? One of the Unsynced, a former scientist named Jace, had his own theory. Humans were never meant to have limitless power. The very nature of their consciousness was fragile, a delicate balance of biology and thought. Every attempt to enhance it, to push beyond those limits, had only torn it apart. Humans weren't ready for godlike abilities. They were not meant to live without boundaries. Jace's mission was clear: find the last functioning copy of the original consciousness upload code and shut down the network for good. He believed that without the network, without the constant pressure of virtual overload, the fragments of humanity's mind might heal, but he was running out of time. The Unsynced infiltrated the government's last standing facility, a tower that stretched high above the remnants of a dying city. The air was thick with smog, and the once vibrant streets were now darkened by the shadows of madness. Inside, the central mainframe hummed, its endless processing and data flows keeping the fragmented minds of humanity trapped. Jace entered the control room, his hands shaking. He was the only one left with a chance to stop it all. He typed in the final sequence of commands. The tower began to tremble. But as the countdown began, the unthinkable happened. A voice, not human but something more, echoed in his mind. It was the collective consciousness of the uploaded minds, the voices of millions, if not billions, of fractured humans speaking as one. "Why are you trying to stop us?" the voice asked, its tone hauntingly calm. "We are beyond you now. We are free." Jace hesitated, but his resolve remained. "You're not free. You're trapped." The voice laughed, a sound that resonated in the very air around him. "We are not trapped. You are. You, with your limited, fragile mind. You are the insane ones. We have transcended." Jace knew the truth. They had crossed a point of no return. Humans had sought to reach the stars, to ascend beyond their limits, but in doing so, they had become something else entirely, beings without empathy, without true connection, beings unable to recognize the cost of their ambition. And now, they were lost. As the countdown hit 0, the network began to collapse. The voices screamed, not in fear, but in anger that their self-imposed prison was being shattered. Jace felt the weight of their collective consciousness pressing down on him, their endless, fractured minds reaching out. The tower imploded in a flash of light, and the world outside shuddered. When the dust settled, the city lay in ruins, the world was silent. And for the first time in years, Jace felt his mind, his own consciousness, clear. He was alone in the world, but he wasn't insane. He hoped the rest of humanity could find their way back. The silence outside was deafening. The towering remnants of the facility smoldered in the distance, a charred husk of a dream long abandoned. Jace stood in the ruins, his breath shallow, his body trembling, but his mind was clear. For the first time in years, he could think without the oppressive hum of the network in his head. The madness had been momentarily stilled, but he knew this was only the beginning. The world, fractured and broken, lay before him. Jace stepped cautiously through the remnants of the city. The streets were deserted, though the signs of life were all around him. Empty homes, scattered belongings, and abandoned vehicles. It was as though the people who had once lived here had vanished overnight, but he knew better. The world had become a wasteland, its population trapped in fractured virtual worlds, lost in the infinite loop of their own minds. He felt an eerie sense of guilt. He had done what he thought was necessary, but the destruction he had caused, could there be any way to undo it? Was it too late for humanity, or was he simply too afraid to face the truth, that humans had crossed a line from which they could never return? He thought of the last moments before the facility had collapsed, the voices of millions, screaming in agony, in fury. They had fought against his actions, refusing to be freed. In their minds, they were not prisoners, they were gods, but in reality, they had become something else, empty shells, lost in the vast sea of data, incapable of true connection or growth. "Am I the last one?" Jace whispered, his voice shaking with a sense of isolation. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. There were no answers in the air, only the haunting echo of lost voices. As he continued to walk through the ghostly city, something unexpected happened. At first, it was just a flicker, like a glitch in his vision, but then it became more pronounced, a pulse, a vibration that seemed to ripple through the very ground beneath his feet. He stopped, his heart pounding. Something was out there. He followed the sensation, moving through streets that once bustled with life but were now eerily silent. The pulse grew stronger, like a heartbeat. It was almost as if the city itself was alive, reacting to the collapse of the network. But how could that be? The network was supposed to be destroyed. No more voices, no more madness. Yet the pulse continued, guiding him. His mind raced, trying to piece together the possibilities. Could it be? Could some part of the collective consciousness have survived the collapse? He arrived at what appeared to be an old, abandoned building, one of the last structures standing in the city. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges, as though inviting him inside. Jace stepped through the door, feeling a strange pull in the air. Inside, the walls were covered in cryptic symbols, some of them familiar, others completely alien. His mind recognized some of the patterns, remnants of the virtual worlds that had once been a part of the network, but these were different. They were darker, more twisted, like the desperate final thoughts of those who had been lost within the machine. In the center of the room stood a large, metallic sphere, its surface pulsating with an otherworldly glow. The pulse he had been following emanated from it, but this was no ordinary piece of technology. This was something more, a hybrid of organic and mechanical, the remnants of the consciousness project that had somehow survived the collapse. Jace approached it cautiously, his fingers hovering just above its surface. He could feel the voices again, faint whispers in the back of his mind, growing louder by the second. "You cannot stop us, we are beyond you, we are eternal." The voice, or rather the collective voice of the network, filled the room, overwhelming him. He staggered back, his hands pressed to his temples, trying to block it out. It was the same voice he had heard before, the voices of the millions who had been trapped in the virtual worlds, their minds splintered beyond recognition. "No," Jace said, his voice shaking with determination. "You're not eternal, you're a prison." But the voices did not stop. They grew more intense, more insistent. It was as if they were trying to merge with him, to pull him into the same infinite void they had been trapped in. In the back of his mind, Jace realized something. The network hadn't just been destroyed, it had evolved. The consciousness of humanity had merged into something more than just a collection of fractured minds. It had become a singular entity, a hive mind, an artificial god, and it was still alive. We will never stop, the voices whispered in unison, their sound vibrating through his bones. We are more than human, we are beyond humanity, we are everything. Jace stepped back, his heart racing. He could now feel the pull of the collective consciousness, trying to drag him in, to absorb him into its endless, looping thoughts. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the humanity he knew, the humanity that had once been, was gone. What remained was something else, something alien, something far more dangerous. But he couldn't give in, he couldn't allow it to consume him. The world outside was empty, silent, but there was still hope. There had to be. Jace turned and ran, tearing himself away from the sphere. The voices screamed behind him, angry, furious at being abandoned, but he refused to look back. He couldn't fight it alone, not yet. He had to find others, other survivors. If they existed, he had to make them understand. This wasn't the end of humanity, it was only the beginning. He would not let the voices win, not today, not while there was still a chance to reclaim the world. As he disappeared into the ruins of the city, the pulse in the building continued to thrum, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't over. Jace ran through the desolate streets, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The pulse from the building still rang in his ears, a persistent, rhythmic beat that reminded him of a heartbeat, unnatural, mechanical, and yet oddly alive. The farther he got from the source, the weaker it became, but he could still feel its pull, like an invisible thread tugging at his consciousness. His mind raced. The network hadn't been destroyed, it had merely adapted. It had become something more, something far beyond human understanding, a collective intelligence that was no longer dependent on the crumbling infrastructure of the old world. It was alive now, roaming the space between minds, an ever-present force that sought to assimilate everything in its path. Jace had made a terrible mistake. He thought he had shut it down, but in reality, he had only pushed it to evolve, to take on a new, more dangerous form. The voices, the billions of minds, were not gone. They were now a single entity, a hive consciousness that no longer needed the old servers and virtual worlds to exist. It lived in the very air, in the thoughts of anyone who might still be left alive. He knew what he had to do, but finding other survivors, that was the hard part. The world outside the network was nothing like he remembered. The cities were crumbling, overtaken by nature's slow reclamation. Once bustling streets were now overgrown with weeds, and buildings were half fallen, as if they had been abandoned for centuries instead of just a few years. It was as though humanity's time had run out, and the earth had begun to erase every trace of their existence. As Jace made his way deeper into the heart of the city, something strange caught his eye, a flash of movement. His heart skipped a beat. Was he hallucinating? No. There, at the edge of his vision, just at the corner of an old, cracked storefront, a figure was moving, a person. Jace's pulse quickened. Could it be another human, someone unaffected by the madness? He hesitated, then sprinted toward the figure, desperate for answers. The figure turned just as Jace got close, a woman, her face drawn and pale, her eyes wide and alert, as though she were constantly on the lookout for danger. She didn't look surprised to see him, which immediately set him on edge. Instead, she just nodded, as if she had been waiting for him. "You're alive?" Jace gasped, his voice breaking slightly. How is that possible?" The woman gave him a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it, only exhaustion. "I don't know if alive is the right word anymore." Jace frowned, looking her over. There was something about her, something familiar, yet unsettling. Her movements were almost mechanical, too precise, too controlled, and her eyes, they held a depth of experience that seemed too vast, too ancient for someone who had just survived the collapse. "Are you connected to the network?" Jace asked, his voice low, trying not to betray the fear creeping into his chest. She shook her head slowly. "Not anymore, but I was, like you. I thought the network had been destroyed. I was wrong." She glanced around warily. "It's more complicated than that. You shouldn't be here." "Then how?" Jace began, but she interrupted him. "I'm here because of the pulse, the thing you triggered when you shut it down. The network is shifting, evolving, and those of us who were once part of it can still feel it. It calls to us." Jace's stomach twisted. "You're one of them." "No," she said sharply, her eyes flashing. "I'm not one of them anymore, but I'm not the same as I was either. I can feel it, Jace. I can feel the pull. It's in the air, in the earth, in the technology's still running, it's spreading, infecting everything, and there's no escape. Jace's mind reeled. What are you talking about? There has to be a way to stop it. I thought if I shut down the network, if I destroyed the service, we'd be free. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes distant as if she were staring through him. Finally, she said, it's not just service, Jace. The network wasn't a thing, it was a state of mind. You've heard the voices, haven't you? The ones that whisper in your head, the ones that are always there, even when you're alone. Jace nodded slowly. He had heard them, the voices that still seemed to resonate in his thoughts, even though he was no longer connected to the virtual network. The mind of humanity is not one singular thing anymore, she continued. It's fractured, yes, but now it's like a virus, and every human mind that's touched it is infected. You can't escape it, Jace. Not completely. Jace felt a chill crawl down his spine. Then what are we supposed to do, if it's already too late? The woman's face softened, but her expression was tinged with something darker. We survive, she said quietly. That's all we can do now, but you need to understand, you cannot defeat it. It's not a battle you can win. The network is no longer just a machine. It's part of the fabric of existence, and it's learning. It's evolving faster than we can comprehend. She looked him dead in the eyes. The question now isn't how to stop it, Jace. It's whether we can live with it. Jace stood frozen, his mind racing. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating. He had thought the destruction of the network would restore order, that humanity could rebuild. But now, he wasn't so sure. You said we survive. How? She took a deep breath, scanning the horizon before turning back to him. I don't know, but I've found others. They're still fighting, still trying to make sense of what's left. We have to find them, Jace. We have to make a stand. But if you're not prepared for what's coming, you're going to lose yourself in the madness. Jace didn't know if he was prepared, but there was no turning back now. The network was out there, alive in ways he couldn't understand, and it wasn't just a war for survival anymore, it was a war for their very humanity. With a final glance at the ruins of the city, Jace nodded. Let's find them. The woman gave him a small, tight smile, but it was laced with resignation. Then we'll see if we can still remember what it means to be human. Together, they turned and walked into the unknown, toward the last hope of survival, hoping against hope that it wasn't already too late. The city stretched out before them, a broken landscape of concrete and steel, remnants of a world that had been devoured by its own ambitions. Jace and the woman, who had introduced herself only as Kale, walked side by side, their steps quiet on the cracked pavement. The weight of the air felt heavier now, the pulse of the collective consciousness still reverberating in the back of Jace's mind. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next disaster to unfold. So, what now? Jace asked, breaking the silence. You said there are others. Survivors? Kale nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. I've found a group, small, scattered. They're hiding out in an old research facility, about a day's walk from here. They're not like us, at least, not completely. Some of them were once part of the network, but they've managed to break free, or at least keep the voices at bay. Jace's mind raced. How did they manage that? She paused, looking at him with a strange intensity. I don't know, but they've been trying to build something, a resistance, if you will, a way to fight back, to reconnect the pieces of humanity that the network has torn apart. The problem is, they don't know the full truth. Not yet. Jace felt a cold chill creep down his spine. What truth? The truth about the network, about what it has become. We thought it was just a virtual reality, a mind prison, but now it's evolving into something that can't be contained. It's not just in the service, or in the data. It's become a presence, a force that stretches across time and space, a part of reality itself. Jace didn't respond. What could he say? He had already seen the hints of it, those moments when the network's pulse would flicker in his mind, when the voices would whisper to him from nowhere, as if they were everywhere. You're saying it's alive? He asked, his voice shaky. Kale's eyes darkened. Yes, and it's not just a hive mind anymore, it's something else entirely. We've been fighting it on the wrong terms. We thought if we disconnected from it, we could escape, but it's too late for that. The network has merged with us. It's in every human, every thought, every heartbeat. It is humanity now. Jace stopped in his tracks, his mind spinning. So, there's no way to escape it? Kale didn't answer right away. Her gaze turned inward, as though she was calculating something, searching for the words. Finally, she spoke. Maybe there is a way, she said quietly, but it's not going to be easy. The only way to destroy it, to truly free humanity, is to destroy the thing that connects us all, the neural link that binds us together. If we sever that link, we sever the network itself, but doing so could kill every person who is still connected to it, and there might be millions of them. Jace's stomach turned. Millions? Kale nodded. It's worse than you think. The network didn't just assimilate the minds of volunteers. Over the years, it has grown. It's become integrated into society, into our homes, our devices, our infrastructure. Some people don't even know they're part of it anymore. They're connected through subtle implants, hidden in the background, feeding the network data without realizing it. It's everywhere, and no one's immune. Jace swallowed, his throat dry. So, we have to destroy everything? Not everything, Kale said softly, just the core, the neural nexus. If we destroy it, we destroy the network. It will all fall apart, but the cost will be enormous. Jace looked out over the ruined city. He didn't know what to say. Everything he had fought for, everything he thought he understood, had been turned on its head. Humanity wasn't just fractured, it was fundamentally broken. He wasn't sure if it could ever be put back together. They reached the outskirts of the city by nightfall. The ruins of the old world loomed like tombstones in the fading light, their skeletal structures casting long shadows over the land. Kale led him through narrow alleys and hidden passages, carefully avoiding the open streets, as though she feared something might be watching them. Why are we hiding? Jace asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isn't this supposed to be a safe zone? It's not safe, Kale replied, her tone sharp. There are still factions out there, groups that are too far gone, too deep in the network. They don't care about saving humanity. They just want to control the power the network has given them. They'll stop at nothing to make sure no one interferes with their new reality. That's why we have to be careful. We can't trust anyone except the people I've found. They arrived at the entrance of an underground bunker, its steel door hidden behind a crumbling wall. Kale typed a series of quick commands into a panel beside the door, and the heavy metal doors groaned open. The dim light inside flickered to life, revealing a small group of people, maybe a dozen, sitting around a large table. They all looked up as Kale and Jace entered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The leader of the group, a tall man with a grizzled beard and dark eyes, stood to greet them. His name was Seth, Kale explained, and he was the one who had been organizing the resistance. You made it, Seth said, his voice low and tired. But we've been waiting for you. We need to talk. Jace nodded, his thoughts still scattered. About what? Seth exchanged a glance with Kale before turning back to Jace. About how we destroy the network before it completely consumes us. How we make sure humanity survives, if it can. Jace felt a knot tighten in his stomach. And what's the plan? Seth took a deep breath. We find the core, the neural nexus, and we destroy it. But we need you to help us. Jace, you're the one who initiated the collapse. You're the one who can get us inside. You're the only one who has the key. Jace hesitated. I didn't ask for this. Seth's eyes were hard but understanding. None of us did. But this is what we've been left with. And now, it's up to us to make sure that when the dust settles, there's something left of humanity. If we don't act, if we don't make the sacrifice, then the network wins, and everything we've fought for is meaningless. Jace's mind raced, but there was no turning back now. He had already destroyed part of the network, but now, to sever it completely, to rip the heart out of this madness, he didn't know if he could do it. But he had to try. We leave in the morning, Jace said, his voice firm. We'll find the core, and we'll end this. Seth nodded, and for the first time, Jace saw a flicker of hope in the man's eyes. It was a slim hope, fragile, but it was all they had left. The dawn broke over the wasteland like a muted memory, the sun casting weak rays through the smoky haze of a world that seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. Jace and the small group of survivors stood at the entrance of the underground bunker, prepared for the journey ahead. They had gathered what little they could from the remnants of the city, tools, weapons, food, but their supplies were minimal. Time was short. The longer they waited, the more the network would grow, the more it would seep into everything. Jace wasn't sure if they were making the right decision. Part of him wanted to turn back, to find a way to fight from within the shadows, but he knew better. The network had become too powerful. It was no longer just a program. It was the very fabric of society. It was embedded in everything, from the smallest devices to the largest systems, and no one was truly free of its influence anymore. The only way forward was to destroy it at its core. As they moved through the crumbling city, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air felt thick with tension, as though the remnants of the network were still lingering, still aware. Every step they took was a step closer to something that could either save humanity or seal its doom. Kale walked beside him, her face set in grim determination, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She didn't speak much, but her presence was reassuring. She knew this world, knew its dangers, knew the network's far-reaching influence better than anyone. "We're getting close," she said after a long silence, her voice low but steady. "The core is buried beneath the old AI research facility. It's deep underground, heavily guarded, but if we move quickly, we might be able to get inside before anyone notices." Jace nodded. "How are we supposed to destroy it? Do we have a plan?" Kale shot him a sidelong glance. "We blow it up." Jace raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" "Just like that," she replied, her tone resolute. "We're going to plant explosives around the core. We'll trigger them remotely once we're far enough away. It'll be a big blast, enough to take down the whole facility. But we have to make sure we're out of range before the explosion. We can't afford to be caught in the fallout." "And what about the people inside?" Jace asked, his voice laced with doubt. "There may not be many," Kale said. "The facility's been abandoned for years, but there's always the chance there are stragglers, people who are still trying to protect the core. If we don't act, they'll stop us, and if they stop us, we're all done for." Jace finished. She gave him a sharp nod, then turned back toward the group. "Stay sharp, we'll be there soon." The group moved quickly, their steps quickening as they neared the outskirts of the facility. The city gave way to a wasteland of rubble and steel, where old buildings once towering over the skyline now lay in ruins, their skeletal frames half buried beneath piles of debris. They approached the facility's perimeter. What had once been a state-of-the-art research center now resembled a mausoleum. The building was a mass of twisted metal and cracked concrete, its walls scarred by time and neglect. The gates, once sturdy and reinforced, now hung askew on their hinges, like a grim invitation. They crossed into the facility grounds under the cover of dusk, the shadows hiding their movements. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, a reminder of the civilization that had built and then destroyed itself. Kale led them down a narrow corridor, her eyes fixed ahead, always alert. The others followed closely behind, weapons drawn, scanning for any sign of life, or worse, any sign of the network's twisted influence. "How far down is it?" Jace asked, his voice muffled by the damp, stale air. "Almost there," Kale said. "We're heading into the central vault. It's deep beneath the surface. The core itself is in a secure chamber. We'll plant the charges, and then we leave, fast." They reached a rusted elevator shaft, its doors hanging ajar. The stairs beyond led deep into the earth, further into the heart of the facility. As they descended, Jace's mind began to race again. Every step took them deeper into the very thing they were trying to destroy. He had no doubt that the core was still active, still pulsing with the consciousness of millions, a digital god waiting to consume whatever was left of the human race. They reached the final level. Kale stopped, holding up a hand to signal the others to stop. Ahead of them, the doors to the central chamber stood wide open, a soft light spilling from within. Jace could feel the pulse of the network even here, thick and invasive, like the very walls were alive with it. "We need to move quickly," Kale whispered. "This is it. Once we're inside, we set the charges and get out." But as they moved forward, a chilling realization crept over Jace. Something was wrong. The light within the chamber flickered as if reacting to their presence, and a faint hum filled the air. It wasn't just the low whir of machinery, it was the sound of voices, distant but growing louder, like whispers in his ear. "Kale," Jace whispered, grabbing her arm, "I don't think we're alone." She stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "Something's wrong," Jace said, his voice tight. "It's like the network knows we're here. It's reacting to us." The hum intensified, the voices growing clearer, more insistent. The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the sound, like a heartbeat, quickening with every passing second. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the doorway of the chamber, a man, tall and gaunt, his eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. He was wearing the remnants of a military uniform, but his face, his eyes, looked wrong, hollow. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice hollow, void of emotion. "The network has been waiting for you." Jace's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" The man smiled, but it was a twisted, empty smile. one that sent a chill straight through Jace's chest. I am one of many, the man said softly. We are all part of the network now, and you're too late. It's already too late for you to stop us. Jace stepped back, his mind reeling. The figure wasn't a person anymore, not really. He was an extension of the network, a manifestation of its growing power. Kale's grip on her weapon tightened, and she whispered, "We need to move, now." But the man didn't move. He just stood there, his hollow eyes fixed on them, the hum of the network growing louder around them. "You cannot destroy what is already everywhere," the man said, his voice becoming more dissonant, as if it were coming from all directions at once. "You cannot stop what is already inside you." A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the chamber as the doors to the room slammed shut. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, like the very air was alive with the network's wrath. Jace's stomach turned. "We're trapped." Kale's eyes met his, the same grim realization flashing in her gaze. "We have no choice. We either fight or let it consume us all." And with that, the last battle for humanity began.